Hello again for this week, and we're just going to quickly cover initially what we were talking about the last 2 weeks, where we're really exploring how to control light and exposure in your camera. And we got to the point last week of saying exposure in your camera is all about how much light your camera lets in to land on the sensor. And we identified there's 3 controls on your camera that actually control that light. And those 3 controls are your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO. But we also discussed last week the fact that it's not really just how much light lands in your camera, but how it lands. And we looked at how we could use the controls of aperture and shutter speed last week, of using them to create interesting photographs and creative photographs, rather than just a straight snapshot where everything was in focus, to allow a more creative and interesting aesthetic. So that's what we're going to explore over this year, is how each one of these controls can both change the amount of light that goes into your camera, but each of them has an aesthetic aspect to it as well. So when we're talking about each one of these controls and the amount of light that lands in your camera, I've got here the analogy of the amount of light that would land in a bucket, or the amount of water would land in a bucket if you had 3 ways of controlling that water. And we always have. We've got the size of our hose. If we had a really round, large fire hose and turned it on, we could fill this bucket very, very quickly. If we try and fill it through a bit of polypropylene piping attached to a tap, then it may take 10 minutes to actually fill it. So the size of the hole is really important in how much light gets in the camera, and that's our aperture. But the other thing that we know about trying to fill a bucket full of water, it depends on how long you leave the hose on. If you just give it a short, sharp burst with a polypropylene hose, you wouldn't never fill the bucket. If you give it forever with the big fire hose, you'd completely swamp everything and probably tip the bucket over. So the shutter speed is how long you leave that tap on for. You can either give it a short, sharp burst or leave it on for a very long time. The last thing is how porous the bucket is. You can try and fill a bucket that's a sieve forever and hardly get any water in it, because it lets the water out as soon as it starts to come in. And that's really the sensitivity of your sensor, whether it's porous or not, whether it is very sensitive and captures every drop of water that goes in there, or every drop of light. And that's our ISO setting. And low ISO settings are very porous, and high ISO settings are very firm and non-porous. So that's those 3 elements all work at the same time, just like they would if you were filling a bucket of water. You have to set 2 of them, and the 3rd one will give you your right exposure. So you've always got that capability of setting 2 to get exactly what you want in terms of aesthetics and how the light lands. But the 3rd one you have to set to give you the right brightness. That's all there is to it, because you've at the end of the day got to have the right amount of light in there. And just like with the water, you've got to decide how much you want in there and control one of those things. So if you can keep that in mind, that you've always got these 3 parameters that are controlling how much light's getting in and also the aesthetic of the image. Today we're going to just look at aperture, because aperture is the most important choice when it comes to aesthetics. it does allow you very easy, it's a bit like the fire hose versus the polypropylene tube, a very easy choice in how much you allow in terms of light, but it's the most important of how it impacts what your image actually ends up looking like. So your aperture, the definition of aperture, if you look it up in the dictionary, is an opening hole or gap. That's an aperture. And so really that's all you're describing is you've got these series of blades that open and shut, which are in your camera, and they open and shut over the lens. And so when they're completely open, that's when you have a wide open aperture, and wide open apertures have a little number. So it's the reverse of a large aperture is not a large number. A large aperture is a small number, or an f-stop as we call it. The high number is the very, very tiny hole, and that's equivalent to your polypropylene tubing. It takes forever to get light into this hole, and you've got to have your shutter open for a very long time so that it gets through this hole onto your sensor. When you've got this very wide open aperture, you need a really sharp shutter speed, really, really quick, because you open up that hole and the light just floods in. So you need to shut it off really quickly so you don't make your image way too light and blow it out. So the question a lot of people ask me is, why not just open the aperture up to full width and just let plenty of light in? Because by letting plenty of light in, you can then reduce the amount that lands on your sensor by increasing the shutter speed. And having a high shutter speed means you're not going to get any blur from movement of the grass or flower or person that you're shooting, because it's going to be so sharp and so quick that you'll just snap them. And also you'll never get any camera shake, because even if you're using a long lens, you've got the opportunity of camera shake. But if you've got a fast shutter speed, you're not going to get any camera shake. And when I first started shooting, that's what I did. I chose the mode aperture priority, and I opened my aperture wide up, and most of the time I got great photos because I didn't get my camera shake or my blur anymore, because the camera, I told it to have a wide open aperture, so it automatically created a very fast shutter speed for me and solved all my problems. And I shot like that for probably a few years, but every now and again I'd end up with really weird results, that everything was blurry. And I've had a number of you say to me, why are my photos always blurry? I'm really, really careful about where, focusing on the subject and holding the camera still, and my photos are still blurry. And it's because it's almost a quick fix having this aperture wide open. But the trouble is, having it wide open means that 95% of your photo won't be in focus, ever. Only the spot where your focal point is currently located will be sharp. And so even at f4, which is a lot more than f1.4, you can see only this bit of the image is in focus. Everything else is out of focus. And that's a focal plane. So it's like you've sliced through the distance, and in the distance you've just got probably about a centimetre of sharpness. And everything else before and, in front and behind is blurry. In this one, I've used f25 because I was shooting down. It's quite a large flower, this one. It would be about 6 or 7 centimetres across. And I was shooting down, but it's quite deep as well. I don't know whether it's multiple flowers in one, but that's what it was. And I wanted the whole thing sharp because it was so beautiful. And there wasn't enough interest in the little bits to make one section sharp. So I used f25. So if I tried to shoot this one up here with an f4, I would have just got some of these petals, I guess you call them, or leaves, sharp, but the rest would have been blurry. Or if I'd focused down here, all of this upper region would have been blurry and it would have made a really weird photo. This one down here, I deliberately chose to just pick the flower that was sunlit to be sharp. Because it was sunlit, it's where your eye would go immediately, and that's what needed to be sharp. And it makes for a much more artistic photo. Whereas this one is more of a graphic, abstract sort of photo. So it's what feel you're going for. You can't just be lazy and go, I shoot aperture priority and always just put it on f4, because you will end up with a lot of very blurry photos a lot of the time. So the factors impacting your f setting that you set for your aperture are all about the aesthetics, and for you knowing and thinking about what aesthetic that you want for the particular photo that you're taking. Do you want everything sharp? Are you taking a landscape and you want the foreground, midground, and background sharp? Well, if you do, you need to have a high number or shut down your aperture to allow you to have what we call a large depth of focus or a large depth of field, so that it's sharp all the way through. Or if you want to create an artistic photo of something that you could put on the wall that looks like a painting, then you need to really open up that aperture and have a really small depth of field or depth of focus. So we call that depth of focus, that's your focal plane. And so for this flower, the dogwood, it's just right through here. It's just a sharp, possibly, I don't know, centimetre and a half plane of focus, very small. Everything behind it is blurry. And it makes for a much more interesting photo, and it also allows the viewer to really know what you want them to look at. When the photo has a lot of clutter in the background, the viewers are always a bit confused about what should I be looking at. So again, I can't just go, well, if you're shooting flowers, shoot them at 1.8 or f.4, or you can't just say that, because the difficulty is there's two other factors that impact the depth of focus you're going to get. It's not only your aperture, but it's what lens you have on the camera and its current set lens length. If you've got a very long lens, then you will get these sorts of blurry photos very, very easily. If you've got a wide angle lens, then they tend to, at f4, have a good deal of the background in focus. All of this background would have been in focus if I'd used a wide angle lens. But by using a long lens, in this one I used about an f200, I could know that at f4 I could get the background completely blurry. The other is how far away you are from the subject. If you're focusing on the city in the background, and that's where your focal point is, you're actually focusing 10 kilometres away because you can see that city skyline, then you've got a massive depth of field, even if you're using f4 and a long lens. So these three parameters, the f number you're using, the lens you're using, and the distance you are from the subject, all interact with each other to give you the look, which is what makes being a good photographer. If you can master these three, you're 90% there in terms of being a really good photographer and getting really beautiful, creative, artistic shots. But it is about understanding your camera and your lens. And when I first started playing around with Aperture, I just used what we call a prime lens. It was just a 100mm lens, because I couldn't bear having too many variables, and that just meant then I had to think about the distance and the f-stop. So I practiced and practiced and practiced with the same length lens and the distance and the f-stop to try and understand that lens exactly what the focal point would be. So when you're trying to improve your photography, you're trying to improve the aesthetics of the image. Always prioritize your aesthetics and select your f-stop accordingly. It's a lot more than just taking a snapshot. So this image here, this is when I first got my really long lens, and I had, it goes from 70 to 300. And I had no idea about its focal plane, because every time you get a new lens and you start playing with it, it's got a completely different focal plane for that particular f-stop. So on this one, I was focusing at f.4, and you can see I was about 3 meters away from the bird. You can see by the sharp line of grass through there, the depth of focus is only about 2 centimeters. And it's that plane there through the bird and through its leg is the only part of that image that's in focus. Everything else is out of focus. So, you know, it's through its leg, up through its neck, sharp, end of its beak's not sharp. It's a very, very narrow depth of field for being 3 meters away from that bird, because I am using a long lens and I've shut it down to f4. So what I want to show you with this diagram here is the lens length that they've used for this diagram is about, it's a wide angle lens. It's about probably about a lens length of 24. And the camera, the distance to the subject, which is the man, is retained through every single one of these images. So the distance is standard and standardized. The lens length is standardized. So all that's happened through this series of images is the f-stop has changed. So you can see when the f-stop is wide open and very low number, that only the man is in focus. So he's about 4 to 5 meters away from the cameraman, and just that distance there, that probably 1 meter, is in focus. As he goes up the f-stops, more and more is coming into focus, the front of the cow's head and the back of this person. So this is a focal plane that if you focus on the person in the image, the focal plane is widening as you're increasing your f-stop number and narrowing down the hole. So as we narrow down the hole, more and more come into focus. And when we get up to f22, everything's in focus. You just need to be aware, and I wasn't aware of this for quite some distance into my photographic career, was it actually waters down the sharpness as you go up to f22. Yes, everything's in focus, but it's not pin sharp. It's sort of in focus. If you have a very big opening, big aperture hole with a small f-stop number, and you focus on these person's eye, it will be so pin sharp. Even if you're focusing on his eye down here, it'll be watered down focus. It'll be sort of in focus. So there's some of the, because other people will say to me, well, if I'm doing a landscape, I'll just shove it up to f22 and everything will be fantastic. No, it won't. Everything will be sort of in focus, but nothing will be pin sharp. So usually with landscapes, we sort of take them around f11 or f16 to optimize the distance that's in focus, but try and optimize the sharpness. So this is whenever you're shooting, these are all the things that need to be going through your head. And this is why when you're out shooting, it's so exhausting. And I can't have people talking to me while I'm trying to do all these calculations, because I'm always trying to look at the image and go, what do I need to be sharp? Do I need the foreground, midground, and background to be sharp? If I do need that, what lens length have I got on? Oh, I've got my wide angle lens on. Oh, good. If I've got my wide angle lens on, I could even go down to f8 for what I want to take within this photo. So all of this noise is going on in my head, but this is how you get those photos. And the only way it happens is by practicing it. So your aperture rule of thumb is overall, large aperture opening, you're going to get a small focal plane. You'll hear me use the words focal plane, depth of field, and depth of focus. They're all interchangeable. It's this strip down what you're looking through your camera at. It's a strip in the distance that's sharp. And it may be a tiny strip or it may be a really wide strip. And it's where your focal point is. You'll get, that will be the sharpest, and then it will peter off from that where you're moved your focal point to when you were shooting. So when you've got that fire hose, that great big wide open aperture that's letting your sensor flood with light, you've got a really shallow depth of field. And that's why I was saying before, when I first started shooting with a camera that I could change the aperture, people said use aperture priority and just put it down to f4. It'll be fine. Very shallow depth of field. Most of my photos were blurry. The alternative is have all your photo sharp all the way through, and that's the sort of look and feel you want. But it won't be pin sharp and you won't get an artistic look, but that may be fine. Maybe you're into street photography or something. You really have to rarely go past when you're reducing the hole in your aperture or increasing your f-stop. I rarely go past 16 because we have what we call a sweet spot in the lens, and the sweet spot is where it gives your ideal sharpness, and that's around here. Most lenses are around probably 8 to 11 in terms of their sweet spot where everything's really sharp. As soon as you go up to around 32, you start to get the lens isn't as sharp and you've paid a lot of money and you're still going to have a bit of a blurry photo. So I've mentioned that the depth of field, that plane of sharpness that we get through our image, is dependent on the f-stop, how far we are away from the subject when we're focusing on them. So we're focusing on the subject, and the distance between the camera and the subject is a variable in here. And the other variable is the focal length of your lens. Whether you're using a wide angle lens and everything is in the picture, or whether you're using a long lens and you're just taking a very small part of the view that your eyes can see. And when you're using a zoom, you're sort of zooming in and out to get the framing right, you've always got to be aware, are you at the longest part of your lens? So if your lens zooms from 24 to 100, the 100 millimeters is the long part of your lens. And if you're zooming back to 24, that's when it's a really wide open lens, then that will have an impact on the depth of field. When your lens is really wide open, even down to f4, you've got a good deal in focus. When your lens is really long and you're just capturing this much of what you can see, you've got a really small depth of field. That's the sort of thinking, it does your head in. So this is about what do you want? I was in a tulip field and just with a wide angle lens looking down, wanted to capture the tulips. I didn't care if the ground was in focus or not, but I did want to get the leaves all the way through. And so this was my really wide angle lens. I did it at as a wide angle at 17 millimeter. I had an aperture of f5.0, and I was a distance a metre above, so I was just above the tulips like that. And it was a look that I wanted. In this case, I've used exactly the same f-stop, 5.0. I'm the same distance from the Strzelecea, but I've used my long lens. This is actually my macro lens I used for this, which is 100mm. And you can see the only part of this photo that's truly in focus is this little bit here. Its depth of focus is very, very small. It probably even less than 3 centimeters. It's a very, very small part of that photo. Whereas this, the depth of focus is probably right through to the base of the stems of the tulips. So knowing what lens you have on the camera impacts in your head what f-stop that you will need and what the aesthetic will be. So this is my warning about when you've got a zoom lens of 24 to 70, or even my 70 to 300. I've got to always be aware of what end I am when I'm doing a zoom, of am I at the 70 or am I at the 300, because it'll make a big difference about what's in focus in the image I'm going to be taking. And so that was looking at lens length. The other thing that we need to look at is how far are we away from the subject. And in this case, I was taking my wisteria and I was about 5 meters away from it, up a ladder, because it hangs down over my patio. I had an f-stop of 7 and my lens at 100mm. And that allowed me then to get it sharp all the way through. This is the fern I've got on the patio, and I had a same aperture, f7, same lens, but I was right up close. And so because I'm right up close, my depth of field or depth of focus has gone down to 5 centimeters. So this is, someone explained it to me once, it's a bit like a piano accordion, that as it's going in and out, so is your depth of, as your lens is going in and out, so is your depth of field inversely changing. The top one I actually took with my longest lens at 400mm. I was up on the top of the local shopping centre at Target, on their right at the top of their car park with my really long lens, and I had it at an aperture of f8. Now, with that long lens at f8, if I was photographing something only a metre away, and you can see I've used that same lens and that same aperture down here, and this monkey was 2 meters away, most of it's out of focus. You know, all the fur at the back's out of focus. Only the eyes, I focused on the eyes, and only the eyes and the nose are sharp. But when I'm focusing far away, like 10 kilometers away, the depth of focus is around 2 kilometers. It's the whole, every building in that city is actually sharp. If I zoom right in, I can look at details in windows. It's so sharp at that distance because it's 10 kilometers away that I'm shooting. I actually stitched this. It's probably about 10 photos stitched together, because at that lens length, I can only get a little bit in. So a little bit in, a little bit in, a little bit in, and then stitched it together. So some people, when they are taking something like the city skyline, think, oh, this is a landscape. I need to put it in landscape aperture mode, which would be about f11, f16. But if you take that skyline at f11 or f16, it waters down the focus. I know that if I take it at f8 and focus on the skyline, I will get it pin sharp. So that's that understanding about watering down your focus as you increase the f-stop and narrow down your lens. So how can you know what's going to be in focus or not? Now with live view, when you're actually looking in the back with live view, you can see in live view what's in focus and what's blurry. And so that's very, very useful. And sometimes some of the cameras will show you using color of what's in focus and what's not in focus. Most of the cameras also have this dedicated depth of field button that if you press this through your viewfinder, it will actually stop down and show you what's in focus and what's not in focus. The live view, most of you got live view, and live view was taken over. Before we had live view, we used to use this dedicated depth of field button. The other option is you can have on your phone these free apps. There's simple depth of field calculator. I use this one, which is just DOF. It's on my phone as DOF. Do I use it? Actually, no, I don't. What I did was sit down with it. You can key in what camera you've got, and you can key in what lens you've got on the camera. And then it will show you, so you put in what lens you've got. It will show you what's, if you focus at a certain distance, so you can select the focal distance, it'll show you what the depth of field is. And in this case, it's 10 inches. So when I'm shooting with a 50mm camera and I'm 5 feet away from the subject, my depth of focus will be 10 inches. I just sat down and played with one of these apps so that I could get in my head this impact. What if I change my lens? What would it be? What if I change my distance? What would it be? And started to get the feel for it. And it's a bit like driving a car and getting the feel for how far in advance you need to brake. How far in advance do you need to brake if the road's wet? How far in advance do you need to brake going at 60k versus 100k? You start to get a feel for it. And then once you've got the feel for it, you don't have to worry about this anymore. And you can then shoot by instinct rather than thinking about the numbers. But you have to go through the hard yards of thinking about the numbers before you can shoot by instinct. And so that's what brings us down to our homework, is that you're going to have a bit of a practice and know how changing this aperture setting on your camera impacts the look and feel you get. So when we're testing anything, we try and keep things standardized. So I want you to set your aperture at the lowest f-stop, say f4. Keep the lens zoom to maximum length. Whatever your zoom is, just make it maximum. Set the focal point on a subject. Make the subject about 1/3 of the way into your image. Take a photo and see how much is in focus. Then set the aperture to the highest f-stop, doing exactly the same thing. Check how much is in focus. Play around with this. Decide which look you prefer. This isn't, there's a right number and a wrong number. It's an aesthetic. What one do you prefer? Now, in order to do this, you either have to be in manual mode or aperture priority mode. And that's just the mode switch on your camera. So that's your homework for this week. Good luck, and you're now on the way to your creative journey in your photography. So thank you.